The hunger was a living thing. It had claws. For 7 days it had been tearing at the lining of her stomach, a frantic, hollow ache that made the world swim at the edges. Alara pressed a hand to her belly, the rough spun tunic doing little to quiet the beast inside. 7 days. They had locked her in the kennels, the cold stone floor leaching what little warmth she had left. Her only company was the smell of damp straw and the whimpers of sick hounds. Once a day, a guard would slide a wooden bowl of thin, greasy water under the iron-barred door. Not food. Just enough to keep her alive for the spectacle. The Luna trials. It was a cruel joke. A brutal tradition where the strongest, fastest, and most ambitious she-wolves of the northern packs vied for the honor of becoming the Alpha King's mate. They were daughters of lords, champions of their clans, trained since birth for this moment. They arrived clad in fine leathers, their bodies honed into weapons, their bellies full of roasted meat and confidence. And then there was her. Ilara, the branded. The thief. She clenched her right hand, the one that bore the mark. A searing, spiraling brand on the back of her hand, courtesy of Lord Valerius. He'd accused her of stealing a loaf of bread from the castle kitchens. She hadn't. She'd been giving her own meager portion to a pup whose mother had died in the winter blight. But Valerius's word was law. He was the king's most trusted advisor, a man whose smile was as sharp and cold as an icicle. He had held the hot iron himself, the memory of her own flesh smoking, the scream she had refused to give him, was seared into her mind as deeply as the mark on her skin. "Let this mark you for what you are," he had hissed, his breath smelling of spiced wine. Worthless, a drain on the pack's resources. Now he was the one who had entered her name into the trials, not as a contender, but as a punishment. A public humiliation. "Let the weak be culled," she'd heard him say to another council member. "Let her run until her heart gives out. It will be a fitting end for a thief." So they had starved her, to ensure she was at her weakest, to make her a pathetic footnote in the grand saga of the Luna trials. The cold bit at her through her threadbare clothes as the guards hauled her from the kennel and shoved her into the line with the others. She stumbled, her legs unsteady. The other candidates recoiled from her, their noses wrinkling at the stench of the kennels that clung to her. Whispers followed her like biting flies. "That's the branded one. Disgusting. Why is she even here? Lord Valerius said she's here to set an example." Alara kept her eyes fixed on the muddy ground. Their words were just echoes of what she'd been told her entire life. She was nothing, an orphan taken in by the pack out of a reluctant sense of duty, always the last to eat, the first to be blamed. The brand on her hand was simply an outward sign of the worthlessness she'd always felt inside. She didn't care about becoming Luna. She didn't care about the Alpha King, a man she'd only ever seen from a distance, a terrifying figure of ice and shadow, the legendary Kalin who had single-handedly ended the Frost Soul Wars a century ago. A king who hadn't chosen a mate in all that time. She was here for the prize offered to all who finished the course, regardless of their place. A full meal. The thought of it, roast chicken, thick bread, a hunk of cheese, was a desperate, painful fantasy. It was the only thing that kept her on her feet. Survive the trial, and she would eat. That was her goal. Not to win. Just to finish. The horn blew, a deep, resonant sound that echoed off the jagged, snow-dusted peaks surrounding the valley. The trial had begun. It was a brutal course through the unforgiving northern wilderness, a 20-mile run over treacherous terrain, through dense, clawing forests and across half-frozen rivers. The other women surged forward, a pack of graceful predators. Alara hung back, conserving what little energy she had. The hunger was a constant, gnawing companion. Every step sent a wave of dizziness through her. But hardship was a language her body knew well. She knew how to run with an empty stomach. She knew how to ignore the burn in her lungs and the ache in her bones. While the pampered daughters of lords relied on brute strength, Alara relied on the grim resilience of a survivor. She found a rhythm. She watched the ground, picking the safest path, letting the others waste their energy scrambling over difficult rocks she simply went around. The cold air was a razor in her throat, but it cleared her head. The forest was familiar. This was where she'd often fled to escape the cruelty of the pack, finding a strange comfort in the silent indifference of the ancient pines. Hours passed. The sun, a pale disk in the gray sky, began its slow descent. She started to pass the other candidates. One was weeping with a twisted ankle. Another was leaning against a tree, gasping for breath, her expensive leather tunic torn. They had burned out, their strength failing them. Alara's strength had always been a flickering ember, never a roaring fire, but it was stubborn. It refused to be extinguished. The hunger was a white-hot agony now. Her vision tunneled. The world became a smear of green and gray. She ran on pure instinct, her body a machine fueled by the singular, desperate thought of food. Just finish. Just get the meal. She broke through the tree line and saw it. The finish line. A simple rope strung between two ancient monoliths at the edge of the training grounds. And beyond it, the assembled court. The pack. Lord Valerius, his face a mask of disbelief. And on a raised dais, a throne of black stone and ice, sat the Alpha King, Kalen. He was even more intimidating up close. Massive, broad-shouldered, with a harsh, beautiful face that looked as if it were carved from a glacier. His silver hair was long, threaded with braids of black leather. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a winter sky before a blizzard, a pale, chilling gray. And they were fixed on her. She realized with a jolt that there was no one else ahead of her. The other contenders were still lost in the woods, or struggling far behind. She had won. The thought was so absurd it barely registered. It didn't matter. All that mattered was crossing that line. She put her head down and forced her screaming legs into a final stumbling sprint, one foot in front of the other. The roar of the blood in her ears drowned out the shocked silence of the crowd. Her foot caught on a root. She pitched forward, arms flailing. She managed to fling her body across the rope just as the world dissolved into blackness. The last thing she felt before consciousness fled was the unforgiving cold of the frozen earth. Pain. A dull, throbbing ache behind her eyes, and something else. Warmth. Not the blistering heat of a fire, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to be seeping into her very bones. It was a sensation so foreign, so utterly blissful, that for a moment Alara thought she must be dead. She forced her heavy eyelids open. She wasn't on the cold ground. She was lying on something soft, impossibly soft. Furs. Piles of them, black and white and gray, smelling faintly of pine and winter. She was in a vast room, its walls carved from dark, polished stone. A massive fireplace crackled merrily at the far end, casting dancing shadows across the ceiling. And she wasn't alone. He was sitting in a high-backed chair near the fire, watching her. The Alpha King, panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog in her mind. She tried to sit up, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. Her body refused to obey. It felt heavy, boneless. "Be still," he said. His voice was deeper than she could have imagined. It wasn't loud, but it resonated in the air, in the stone, in her bones. It was the sound of mountains shifting, of glaciers calving into the sea. He rose from his chair, and the sheer scale of him was breathtaking. He was a giant, a creature of myth. He moved with a silent, predatory grace that was utterly terrifying. He crossed the room in a few long strides and stood beside the bed. Alara flinched, instinctively hiding her right hand, the branded one, under the furs. His pale gray eyes tracked the movement. He didn't comment on it. Instead, he gestured to a small table beside the bed. On it was a wooden tray. On the tray was a bowl of steaming stew, a hunk of dark bread, and a mug of what smelled like mulled cider. The scent hit her, and the beast of hunger inside her awoke with a savage roar. It was all she could do not to weep. "You have earned it," the king said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Eat." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Trembling, she pushed herself up into a sitting position. The furs pooled around her waist. She was still in her ragged tunic. She reached for the bowl, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the spoon. She ate. She didn't taste it. She shoveled the stew into her mouth, hot and thick with meat and vegetables. She tore at the bread with her teeth. She drank the cider in huge, desperate gulps. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever experienced. She didn't look at him, couldn't bear to meet that glacial gaze. She could feel him watching her, his presence a heavy weight in the room. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and her own frantic eating. When the bowl was empty, scraped clean, she finally dared to look up. He hadn't moved. His expression was unreadable, his face a mask of cold control. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Why am I here? In your chambers?" "You finished the trial," he stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I was meant to be culled," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. "A joke." "Lord Valerius's sense of humor is not my own," the king replied. A flicker of something. Disdain? Annoyance? Crossed his features for a barest second. "He underestimated you. They all did." He took a step closer. Ilara shrank back against the headboard. He stopped. "The trials are not about pedigree," he said, his voice dropping lower. "They are about survival, about will. The North is an unforgiving land. It requires a Luna of iron, not glass. You, who were starved and broken, outlasted every pampered daughter of every proud lord. You did not run with strength. You ran with desperation, and that is a power they will never understand." She stared at him, bewildered. Was he praising her? It felt like a trap. No one had ever praised her. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice small. "I require a Luna," he said simply. He held up a hand, and for the first time she noticed he was wearing black leather gloves. "This is not a proposal of love or affection. I have no room for such things. My condition does not allow for it. This is an arrangement. A duty." His condition? She saw it then, the faint mist that bloomed in the air when he spoke, even in the warmth of the room, the unnatural chill that seemed to cling to him like a shroud. "You will be my Luna," he continued. "Your criminal status will be annulled. You will have a place of honor. You will want for nothing. In return, you will provide this kingdom with the appearance of stability. You will be a symbol of the strength I demand." He was offering her everything. Food, warmth, safety, a name. And all he asked for in return was for her to exist. It was too much. It made no sense. Why her? The branded thief. The worthless Omega. As if reading her thoughts, he said, "I saw what you did at the finish line. You didn't just cross it. You threw yourself over it, even as you fell. You would not be denied. That is the will I require." He paused. "Lord Valerius protests, of course. He claims you are unfit, a stain on my court." The fear returned, sharp and familiar. Valerius would never let this happen. He would find a way to destroy her. "I am the king," Kaelin said, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The statement was absolute, a fact as immovable as the mountains. "His opinion is irrelevant. He extended his gloved hand. "Do we have an agreement, Alara?" He knew her name. The sound of it from his lips was strange, powerful. She looked from his hand to his face. She saw no warmth, no kindness, only a stark, cold pragmatism. But she also saw an escape, an end to the hunger, the cold, the whispers. She thought of Lord Valerius's face when he saw her at the finish line, the shock, the fury. A tiny, defiant spark ignited in her chest. Slowly, she brought her own hand out from under the furs. The right one. She laid her branded hand in his gloved one. The brand was ugly, a whirl of scarred tissue against her pale skin. She expected him to recoil. He didn't. He simply closed his fingers around hers. Through the leather, she felt it. A deep, penetrating cold. It was like holding a piece of frozen iron. It should have been painful, but it wasn't. It was just absolute. "Yes, Your Majesty," she whispered. The days that followed were a disorienting dream. Alara was moved from the king's chambers to a sprawling suite of her own, connected by a private, little-used corridor. The rooms were opulent, filled with thick furs, roaring fires, and heavy tapestries that depicted ancient hunts and battles. Servants, their faces a mixture of fear and curiosity, brought her new clothes, soft wool and velvet in deep forest greens and grays. They brought her food whenever she wished. At first, she hoarded it, hiding rolls and pieces of dried meat under her mattress, a habit born of a lifetime of starvation. She only stopped when she realized, with a slow, dawning wonder, that the food would not stop coming. The arrangement was exactly as Kaelin had described it. It was cold, formal. He visited her once each evening in her private sitting room. They would sit on opposite sides of the hearth, the fire blazing between them. He would inquire about her day, if she had everything she needed. She would answer in quiet, respectful monosyllables. He never touched her. He never removed his gloves. He spoke of pack business, of patrols along the icy borders, of disputes between minor lords. He treated her like a new advisor, not a future mate. There was a boundary between them, a wall of ice as real as any physical barrier. She knew the court was in an uproar. She heard the whispers when she walked the halls, always with two of the king's personal guard flanking her. They called her the branded Luna, the kennel queen. Lord Valerius and his faction made their disdain clear, their eyes sliding over her as if she were something unclean. But Kaelin's word was absolute. His public proclamation of her as his chosen had silenced any open dissent. For now, Alara began to study him during their strange, sterile evening meetings. She saw past the terrifying mask of the Alpha King and began to see the man trapped beneath. She noticed the subtle things, the way his eyes would sometimes drift to the fire, a flicker of something that looked like longing in their depths. The slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his hands when he thought she wasn't looking. And the cold. It was a constant presence. Frost would sometimes form on the metal studs of his leather tunic. The air around him was always colder. He never drank the hot cider the servants left, only cool water. One evening, he arrived with a small bleeding cut on his forearm, the result of a sparring session. A servant girl rushed forward with a bowl of warm water and bandages, but her hands were trembling so badly she could barely function. "Allow me," Alara said, her own voice surprising her. She stood and took the bowl from the terrified girl, dismissing her with a nod. Kaelin watched her, his expression unreadable, but he didn't stop her. She knelt before his chair and gently pushed up his sleeve. His skin was shockingly cold to the touch, like marble. She cleaned the wound with careful, practiced motions. She'd tended to enough injured hounds in the kennels to know what she was doing. As she wrapped the bandage, her fingers brushed against his skin. A strange sensation jolted through her, a faint tingle, like static electricity. She saw him inhale sharply, his gray eyes widening almost imperceptibly. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rumble. He pulled his arm back as soon as she was finished. The boundary had been touched. A tiny crack in the ice. Another night she found him in the vast cold library, a place she had discovered and fallen in love with. He was standing before a towering shelf, his head tilted back, reading the spines of ancient leather-bound tomes. He didn't seem to notice her arrival. "I never learned to read," she confessed into the silence. It was a shameful admission, but she felt strangely compelled to be honest with him. He turned his head slowly. The shadows in the library were deep, and they clung to him. "Why not?" "No one thought it was necessary for an Omega orphan to learn," she said, shrugging. "My duties were simpler." He was silent for a long moment. Then he walked to a shelf, pulled down a thin, simple-looking book, and returned to her. He held it out. "This is a book of children's fables," he said. "The letters are large. The words are simple. I will teach you." And so a new ritual began. After their formal meetings, he would take her to the library. He would sit with her, his deep voice patiently sounding out the words, his gloved finger tracing the lines of text. He was a surprisingly gentle teacher. She learned quickly, hungry for the knowledge that had been denied her. And as she learned to decipher the marks on the page, she also learned to decipher him. She saw the profound, bone-deep loneliness in him. For all his power, for all the fear he commanded, the Alpha King was utterly alone. The cold that surrounded him was a prison. One evening, as she successfully read a full page aloud for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. She looked up at him, her face glowing with pride. He was staring at her, his mask completely gone. In his eyes was a raw, aching vulnerability that stole her breath. It was as if he were a man dying of thirst, looking at a spring of fresh water. "You have a strange warmth about you, Alara," he whispered, the words barely audible. "When you are near, the cold, it lessens." He seemed shocked by his own admission. He stood abruptly, the moment shattered. "That is enough for tonight," he said, his voice once again flat and controlled. He turned and strode from the library, leaving her alone with the book, the firelight, and a heart that was beating far too fast. The intimacy that was growing between them, fragile as a winter rose, did not go unnoticed. Lord Valerius watched them with narrowed, calculating eyes. The more favor Kaelin showed Alara, the more Valerius's simmering resentment grew into open hostility. He began his campaign subtly, a whispered word in the corridors, a carefully planted rumor among the court ladies. He spoke of her past, her brand, her unsuitability. He painted her as a conniving stray who had somehow bewitched the king, a weakness that would bring ruin to the pack. Alara felt the shift. The stares grew colder. The whispers became more pointed. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her lessons with Kaelin, on the strange, tentative hope that was beginning to bloom in her chest. But the fear was a constant shadow at her back. Valerius was a patient predator, and she knew he was waiting for the right moment to strike. The king's condition was also worsening. The cold spells became more frequent, more violent. Sometimes, during their lessons, he would have to stop, his breathing growing ragged as a visible layer of frost crept across the leather of his gloves and up his arms. In those moments he would send her away, his voice harsh with a desperate urgency. "Go," he would command, "leave me, now." She would retreat to her rooms, her heart aching with a helplessness she couldn't name. She wanted to help him, to reach out and offer... What? She didn't know. What could a worthless, branded girl do for a king cursed by ancient forces? One night, an old servant woman named Lyra, who had been kind to her, sought her out. Lyra's face was etched with worry. "You must be careful, my lady. the old woman whispered, her hands twisting in her apron. Lord Valerius. He stirs the pot. He speaks of the king's weakness. What is this weakness? Alara asked, her voice low. This curse he carries? Lyra's eyes darted around the empty corridor before she leaned closer. It is the price of his greatest victory. A century ago, he faced the last of the frost souls, an ancient spirit of winter that sought to plunge the world into eternal ice. The king defeated it, but not before the spirit lashed out. It bound a shard of its essence to his soul. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the castle's drafts. It is a creeping death, Lyra continued, her voice trembling. The shard feeds on his life force, replacing his warmth with its own unending cold. For 100 years, his immense power has kept it in check, held it at bay. But it is a constant battle. And lately, the battle is turning. Why? Alara breathed. Emotion feeds it, Lyra said, her gaze filled with a terrible pity. Strong emotion gives the shard purchase. Rage, grief, love. It is why he never took a mate. To feel deeply would be to give the frost soul the power to consume him entirely. Lord Valerius knows this. He believes your presence here, the connection between you, is accelerating the process. He says you are killing the king. The words hit Alara like a physical blow. She stumbled back, pressing a hand to her mouth. Was it true? Was this strange warmth Kaelin felt around her, this fragile thing growing between them, actually poison to him? Was her very existence a death sentence? The secret lay heavy on her heart, a cold stone of dread. Kaelin's warnings to stay away from him during his episodes took on a terrifying new meaning. He wasn't pushing her away to protect himself. He was protecting her. The threat became undeniable at the midwinter feast. The great hall was filled with the lords and ladies of the northern pacts, a rare gathering to reaffirm loyalties. The air was thick with tension. Alara sat at Kaelin's right hand on the raised dais, clad in a gown of deep crimson that was a stark contrast to her pale skin. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, judging, dissecting. Lord Valerius chose his moment perfectly. He rose from his seat, a goblet of wine in his hand, his face a mask of false concern. "A toast," he called out, his voice ringing through the suddenly silent hall. "To our Alpha King, a king who has ruled us for over a century with unmatched strength. But strength, like the winter ice, can become brittle." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a direct, unthinkable challenge. Kaelin's face was stone, but Alara, sitting beside him, could feel the temperature around them plummet. A thin layer of frost began to creep across the surface of their table. "What is the meaning of this, Valerius?" Kaelin's voice was dangerously quiet. "I speak only of what all here can see," Valerius said, gesturing around the hall. "The unnatural chill that follows you. The frost that blooms in your wake. For a century, you have held your affliction in check. But now," his eyes slid to Alara, dripping with venom. "Now, you have introduced a weakness into our court, a distraction, a branded stray who has clearly addled your mind and weakened your resolve. Your control is slipping. The pack is not safe under a king who is being consumed from within." He slammed his goblet down. On cue, a dozen guards loyal to him drew their swords. The lords in the hall shifted, their hands going to their own weapons, their faces a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Valerius had planned this. He was staging a coup. Rage, hotter and purer than anything she had ever felt, surged through Alara. But before she could speak, Kaelin rose to his feet. "You dare!" he snarled, and the word was not spoken. It was a physical force, a wave of absolute cold that blasted through the hall. Torches flickered and died. Wine froze in goblets. A thick, crystalline layer of ice exploded across the floor, racing outward from the dais. The lords cried out in shock and pain as the freezing cold hit them. It was power on a scale none of them had ever witnessed. It was terrifying. But it was too much. Kalen cried out, a strangled, agonized sound. He staggered, clutching his chest. The silver of his hair seemed to turn snow-white. A thick, blue-white frost spiderwebbed across his skin, over his clothes, encasing him. His eyes, fixed on Alara, widened in a silent plea. "Run." Then he collapsed. He hit the stone floor of the dais with a heavy, final thud, no longer a man but a statue of ice. The life in his eyes went out, replaced by a dull, frozen sheen. The great hall descended into chaos. People screamed, scrambling away from the terrifying cold that radiated from the king's frozen form. It was a cold that didn't just chill the skin, it seemed to suck the very life from the air, a vortex of absolute zero where Kalen lay. Lord Valerius stood amidst the pandemonium, a triumphant sneer on his face. This was what he had wanted. He had pushed Kalen, provoked him into an outburst that had allowed the frost soul to finally overwhelm him. "The king is dead," Valerius bellowed, his voice cutting through the noise. "The curse has claimed him. For the good of the pack, I, Lord Valerius, will assume the role of regent." His loyal guards moved to secure the dais, forming a perimeter, their swords held ready. They advanced on Kalen's body, their intent clear, to remove the evidence of their treason. Everyone was running, fleeing the cold, the violence, the shift in power. Everyone except Alara. She was frozen in place, not by the ice, but by a horror so profound it felt like her own heart had stopped. Kalen, the king who had chosen her, who had taught her to read, who looked at her with an aching loneliness that mirrored her own, the man who whispered that she brought him warmth. Gone, frozen, a monument to his own power and pain. Lyra's words echoed in her mind. "Love feeds it. Your connection is killing him." Grief, sharp and unbearable, ripped through her. Valerius was right. She had done this. Her presence had been the poison that tipped the scales. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. "Seize the girl!" Valerius shouted, pointing a finger at her. "She is a witch. Her dark magic is what finally killed our king. She will burn for her crimes." Two of his guards turned towards her, their expressions grim. The sight of them, of Valerius's smug, victorious face, broke her paralysis. Grief gave way to a defiant, desperate rage. No. She would not let this be the end. She would not let this man, the one who had branded her and called her worthless, win. Ignoring the guards, ignoring the searing cold that was now so intense it felt like fire, she ran to Kalen's side. She fell to her knees on the ice-covered stone. The cold was excruciating, 1,000 needles stabbing into her skin, but she barely felt it. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his face. It was like touching glass forged in the heart of a winter that never ended. There was no life, no warmth, nothing. The bond she hadn't even known existed, the fragile, unspoken connection between them, felt strained to the breaking point. It was a thin, fraying thread in a blizzard, about to snap. "Get away from him, witch!" a guard snarled, grabbing her arm. She shook him off with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "No," she whispered, the word a plume of white in the frigid air. She looked down at Kalen's still form. He had told her to run. He had tried to protect her, even at the very end. He had seen something in her no one else had. Not a thief, not an Omega, but a survivor. A woman of iron. She refused to let him die. She refused to accept this. She leaned over him, shielding his body with her own. The guards hesitated, unwilling to get too close to the source of the terrifying cold. She had a moment, a single, desperate heartbeat in time. What had he said? "You have a strange warmth about you. When you are near, the cold." it lessens. It had been her fault. Her presence had fed the curse. But what if it could also be the cure? The thought was madness, a desperate prayer from a powerless girl. But it was all she had left. She placed her hands flat against the thick, crystalline ice covering his chest. Her right hand, the branded one, pressed directly over his heart. She closed her eyes and poured everything she was into that touch. All her grief, her rage, her desperation. The flickering ember of hope that he had ignited within her. The nascent, terrifying love she felt for this cold, lonely king. She refused to let him go. She held on to the memory of his voice teaching her letters, the vulnerability in his eyes, the impossible safety she felt in his presence. She chose him. Over her own survival. Over the fear. She chose him. For a second, nothing happened. The cold seeped through her palms, a biting, deadly agony that threatened to freeze the very blood in her veins. The guards were advancing again. Valerius was laughing. Then, something shifted. A flicker. A tiny spark of warmth deep within her. A place she never knew existed. And it began in the brand. The ugly, scarred whorl on the back of her hand began to glow. Not the dull red of a heated iron, but a brilliant, searing gold, as bright as the heart of the sun. The light was so intense it shone through her own skin. A gasp was torn from her lips as a wave of unimaginable heat erupted from her palms. It wasn't fire. It was something purer. It was life. It was warmth made manifest. The ice covering Kaylin's chest hissed, turning instantly to steam. The golden light spread from her hands, flowing over the ice like molten gold, chasing the crystalline blue frost away. Cracks spiderwebbed across the frozen shell encasing him. The power that surged through her was immense, terrifying, and utterly unknown. It felt like a river that had been dammed for a lifetime had just broken free. It was a part of her, a sleeping giant that had just been woken by the force of her will, by her refusal to let him die. "What is this sorcery?" Valerius shrieked, his triumph turning to horror. The guards stumbled back, shielding their eyes from the blinding golden light. The entire dais was bathed in a warm, brilliant glow that pushed back the hall's oppressive chill. Ilara didn't hear them. All her focus was on Kaylin. The ice was shattering, breaking apart in large chunks that sublimated into mist before they could even hit the floor. The golden energy flowed from her directly into him, a torrent of warmth pouring into the void of cold. She could feel the ancient, malevolent presence of the frost soul recoiling, screeching in silent agony as it was burned away by a power it could not comprehend. Her brand no longer looked like a criminal's mark. The scarred lines had rearranged themselves, blooming into the shape of a radiant, blazing sun. With a final explosive crack, the last of the ice shattered, vanishing into nothingness. Kaylin's body lay free. The deathly blue-white pallor of his skin was receding, replaced by the healthy flush of life. The frost vanished from his hair, leaving it its natural silver. He took a breath. A deep, shuddering gasp that filled his lungs with air for the first time in what felt like an eternity. His eyes flew open. The unnatural, blizzard gray was gone. They were a clear, deep slate, and they were filled with life. And wonder. They were fixed on her. The golden light pouring from Ilara's hands softened, receding back into her until only her brand, her new sunmark, glowed with a soft, warm light. She swayed, the sudden expenditure of energy leaving her dizzy and weak. She felt herself start to fall. A hand, strong and sure, caught her arm. It was warm. For the first time since she had met him, Kaylin's skin was warm. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his movements still stiff, but gaining strength with every second. He didn't look at Valerius. He didn't look at the stunned, silent court. He only looked at Alara, kneeling beside him, her hand still glowing softly. He reached up with his other hand, no longer gloved, and gently touched her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a gesture of such profound tenderness it made her heart ache. "Alara," he breathed, and his voice was different. The glacial edge was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant warmth that vibrated through her. "Witchcraft! She is a witch!" Valerius screamed, his face pale with terror and rage. "Seize her! She has enchanted him!" Kalen slowly turned his head, his gaze finally falling on the treacherous advisor. The power that rolled off him now was not the biting, destructive cold of the curse. It was the clean, immense, and utterly controlled power of the true Alpha King, untainted and whole. "You are mistaken, Valerius," Kalen said, his voice dangerously calm as he rose effortlessly to his feet. He pulled Alara up with him, keeping her tucked protectively against his side. "She is not a witch." He held up her right hand, displaying the glowing sunbrand for all to see. "She is the sun that melts the frost," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "She is the fire that brings the dawn. She is my savior. She is my mate. She is your queen." The declaration hung in the air, undeniable and final. The lords and ladies of the court, who had been frozen in fear and confusion, now stared at Alara with a new emotion, awe. Valerius's face crumpled in defeat. "No, it cannot be." "Guards," Kalen commanded, his eyes never leaving Valerius. The royal guards, loyal only to him, instantly moved, surrounding the traitor and his now cowering men. "Take him to the dungeons. He will await my judgment." As Valerius was dragged away, still sputtering in disbelief, Kalen turned his full attention back to Alara. He framed her face with his large, warm hands, his expression one of overwhelming relief, and a love so intense it was breathtaking. "The cold," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's gone. For 100 years it has been my constant companion, and now, it's just gone." He closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the sensation. "All I feel is you." Tears welled in Alara's eyes, tears of relief, of joy, of a profound, soul-deep recognition. The worthlessness that had been branded into her was gone, burned away by the sun she now carried in her own hand. "I thought I had killed you," she choked out. "They said my presence, our connection, was making it worse." "It was," he admitted, his gaze soft. "You were feeding the curse, yes. But you were also feeding me. You were waking a part of my soul that had been frozen for a century." The frost soul fought back, harder than ever, because it knew. It knew you were its end. He leaned down, resting his forehead against hers. "I was so afraid, not of dying, but of my death hurting you. That is why I pushed you away. I was a fool." "I couldn't let you go," she whispered. "I love you, Alara," he said, the words simple, direct, and earned through fire and ice. "I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you refuse to be broken at the finish line." She finally let the tears fall, and he wiped them away with his thumbs. She was not the branded thief. She was not the kennel queen. She was Alara. And she was loved. She was worthy. "And I love you," she replied, her voice steady and sure for the first time in her life. In the center of the great hall, surrounded by their stunned but hopeful court, the Alpha King lowered his head and kissed his queen. It was not a kiss of ice and shadow, but one of warmth, of sunlight, of a new beginning. 3 months passed, a season of change. The harsh, unnatural winter that had clung to the castle for a century finally broke. True spring came to the Northlands, a tide of green and gold that swept through the valleys. The snows receded from the high peaks, and for the first time in living memory, the sun felt truly warm. Lord Valerius was stripped of his title and lands, exiled to the farthest, most desolate reaches of the kingdom, a fate worse than death for a man so hungry for power. His followers were dealt with, and a new council was chosen, one built on loyalty and merit, not on fear. Elara, the queen, was the heart of this new world. The whispers that had once followed her were replaced by murmurs of reverence. They no longer saw the brand of a thief. They saw the mark of the sun, a symbol of hope and renewal. She walked the halls not with her head down, but held high, Kaelin often by her side. His hand, always warm, would find hers, their fingers lacing together in a simple, constant affirmation of their bond. She was a natural leader, her kindness and resilience resonating with the common members of the pack who had long been overlooked. She established new storehouses, ensuring no one would ever go hungry again. She visited the kennels, not as a prisoner, but as their patron, making sure the hounds were well cared for. She remembered what it was like to be worthless, and she vowed no one under her rule would ever be made to feel that way. Her power was a part of her now, a gentle, steady warmth she was learning to control. It was a power of life and healing. She could coax plants to grow with a touch, soothe the sick with her presence, and her touch was a balm to Kaelin's soul, a constant reminder of his freedom from the cold. One quiet evening, they sat together in the library, the place where their story had truly begun. A fire crackled in the hearth, but the room no longer needed it for warmth. Kaelin's presence was enough. He sat in his large chair, and she was curled on the furs at his feet, her head resting on his knee, a book open in her lap. He ran his fingers through her hair, the movement slow and content. "What are you reading?" he asked, his voice a low, happy rumble. She smiled, tilting the book so he could see. "Children's fables." He chuckled, a warm, rich sound that she loved more than anything. "You have read every great work of philosophy and history in this library. Why go back to that one?" "Because it's the one you used to teach me," she said softly, closing the book and turning to look up at him. "It reminds me of the beginning, of a cold, lonely king who took the time to teach a starving girl her letters." His expression softened, his gray eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. "That king is gone. You melted him." "Good," she said, reaching up to touch the sun mark on her hand. It pulsed with a gentle golden light under her fingers. "I like the man who took his place much better." He leaned down, capturing her lips in a soft, lingering kiss. The world outside, with its politics and duties, faded away. In this room, they were not a king and queen. They were just Kaelin and Elara, two broken souls who had found their other half and become whole. He pulled back, his hand coming to rest on her belly. "The healers say it will be a boy," he murmured, a note of wonder in his voice. Elara placed her hand over his, her heart swelling with a joy so fierce it was almost painful. A new life, a future, a family. Everything she had never dared to dream of. "He will be a prince of summer," she whispered. "He will never know the cold." They sat in comfortable silence watching the fire dance, two people who had found their home in each other. The shadows in the library were no longer menacing. They were soft and peaceful. The story of the feared Ice King and the branded thief was over. A new story, one of warmth and love and a kingdom reborn in the sun, was just beginning. And they would write it together.